Hello and welcome to episode 173 of the Rollo and Slappy Show. Today is December 2nd, 2019, and I am Rollo McFlugel, and with me is Slappy Jones 2. Show notes page for this episode will be mcflugel.com/173, where you'll be able to check out the sponsor, libertymugs.com, where you'll be able to find awesome libertarian-themed mugs and t-shirts and stickers and hats. We just had our Black Friday sale, but since the Christmas season is upon us, be on the lookout for Christmas sales. And also, there's a deadline if you want to have these for Christmas gifts, these mugs are excellent gifts for your family and friends, whether they're libertarians or not. Make sure you get your order in before those deadlines happen. So also on the show notes page, we're going to have links to check out the guest who Slappy is going to introduce.
Yeah, our guest today is Zach Weissmueller. Zach is a writer and video journalist who's been producing documentary shorts, video interviews, and feature articles for Reason TV and Reason.com since 2010. Some of his particular areas of interest include the regulation of the internet, the emerging technology, free speech, medical freedom, sentencing reform, and the drug war. But today, we're going to be talking to him about the situation over in Hong Kong. And I also want to add, he has a video coming out this week on homelessness in America that sounds like one that's worth watching. So go over to YouTube and check that out. But without further delay, here's Zach. All right, so welcome to the show, Zach. What can you tell us about Hong Kong?
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. So I was in Hong Kong in early September, and while I was there, I was kind of a little bit in the eye of the storm. So there had been some kind of escalating violence, and I went out there, and luckily, while I was there, it was a little bit calmer, but, we're taking safety precautions, obviously. But then in recent weeks, it's really escalated again, and things are, I'm sure you've seen the video and imagery coming out of there. There's been, continued clashes with the police, continued clashes between demonstrators and people who don't agree with the demonstrators. Things have turned ugly at times. There's been kind of just this battle that played out on one of the university campuses where several people were injured and arrested. People have been shot. So where it's a chaotic and uncertain situation right now. Nobody knows how it's going to turn out. The U.S. The latest news is that the U.S. has the president has signed into law the Human Rights and the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and then China has retaliated in a sense by saying that our naval ships are no longer allowed to dock in Hong Kong, and there's been some targeted sanctions against various NGOs that are located in Hong Kong. So, yeah, it's a very fraught situation at the moment.
So what little I know about Hong Kong in general is that the British, I guess, had some sort of control over it for a long time. It was handed over to China. I imagine that if you're getting this level of violence, this has been brewing for a while. And I'm guessing something's sparked it to go. But are you familiar with the relationship China has with Hong Kong and how much control and I guess how the people feel about that? And has there been other things going on for years now? And what actually sparked these protests?
Yeah, so the British had control over Hong Kong as a colony for about 150 years, and there was with a brief interim where Japan had control during World War II. But then in 1997, essentially they handed over jurisdiction over Hong Kong to China, but under the condition that it would maintain its political autonomy and maintain this system that was based on something called the Basic Law, which is similar to our Constitution, you might say, and that China would need to respect that autonomy for the next 50 years. So you can do the math. 2047 is when that would come to an end. And what there has always been a little bit of tension there, as you can imagine. But once if you take the history back even a little further, once Mao died and his successor once Deng Xiaoping came to power, he came in with the idea of reforming China. We had what was known as the economic miracle of the 70s, where China started to finally open up its markets, and the Communist Party, while still the sole party in power and still communist in name, kind of gave up on some of the more doctrinaire Marxist aspects that Mao had tried to implement, and there was this kind of burst of prosperity, and Hong Kong, because it had been under the British system, already was kind of like the economically prosperous gem there of China, and so they were looking at that. And so for a while there, everything was kind of copacetic because things were going in that direction. And what really changed the dynamic were a couple of things. One was the ascent of the current president of China, Xi Jinping, which we can talk a little bit more about him later if you like, who his outlook was really to kind of reconsolidate power in the party, and then just China's continual, they have mainland China has become an economic powerhouse in its own right, and so it's become less economically dependent on Hong Kong, and so they do have more leverage to start encroaching. But the real inflection point here, what were the spark, as you put it, was this extradition bill that so it's kind of a random seeming thing, but a Hong Kong resident and his girlfriend went over to Taiwan for a vacation, and then he murdered her in a hotel room and chopped up her body and put it in a suitcase. And then he came back to Hong Kong, and Taiwan wanted to extradite him to try him for murder. So that all seems like, yeah, of course he should go stand trial for murder, but the legislature took the so you have to also understand how the law works there, is that the executive decides what the legislature should consider. So they put on the agenda that there should be this extradition law with Taiwan, but it would also because Taiwan is, this is another controversy, but Taiwan is part of China, that would also make it easier to extradite people to China and to mainland China. And that is what really sparked this, because there had already been some basically kidnappings of dissidents in Hong Kong brought to China, and there were earlier protests. And so that was the spark. People said, we don't want this extradition law. We're afraid that it just further erodes our autonomy, that it's going to be abused, that it's going to be used to target political dissidents, and we want it withdrawn. And the government kind of just let this protests play out a little bit, and then they talked about withdrawing it and didn't do it, and the protests continued, and then they suspended it, which is not technically withdrawing it, and the protests continued, not good enough. And then they also grew in scope. The demands grew. They ended up coming up with 5 distinct demands, and a lot of them were focused on what unfolded with the police brutality. They wanted an independent investigation of the police. They wanted exoneration of all the arrested protesters. They didn't want, them participating in these demonstrations to be held against them. And then perhaps most consequentially, they wanted the chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, to resign and for them to be able to actually elect their chief executive, universal suffrage. And that has really been the sticking point, because they're not letting go of that, and the government really doesn't want that.
So was there much evidence that that Hong Kong would have extradited that guy on their own to Taiwan? Was it just kind of an opportunity for the Chinese government to try to implement this law, or did they feel like they needed to kind of take control of what was going on because they didn't think Hong Kong was going to do the extradition?
Well, the complication is just that there's a lot of in any sort of extradition, there's a lot of bureaucratic wrangling that has to go on, and what they were looking for was, we need to just streamline this process so that it's basically like going across state lines in the U.S. That's their position, but that what the people, particularly the younger people in Hong Kong, what they see what mainland China is becoming. They see this growing surveillance state. They see what is happening to the Uyghur population, who are essentially being put in re-education camps. And they have seen China become increasingly aggressive in the ways that they have kind of tried to intrude into what they have come to view as, their own distinct system and culture. And so there was the umbrella movement of 2014, and that was similarly sparked by something that was not on its face, it's not exactly clear why this would be the impetus for a revolution. But it came. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there.
That's all right.
Yeah.
But we're kind of, I guess, talking about the Hong Kongers see this as kind of a canary in the coal mine kind of deal.
Yeah.
But that makes sense. I mean, we see everything that's happening in China. With all of the what's it called, the surveillance going on, and it is terrifying. I mean, we see a little bit happening over here, and then we compare it to China, and it's like, man, it's not that many steps, potentially to get there. So I think it's certainly warranted to be at least extremely suspicious.
Yeah, and I remember where I was going with that now. So there was so one of the Hong Kong movement is a decentralized, leaderless movement, but there's been a couple of figures who've become kind of the spokespeople or just more prominent. And one of them is Joshua Wong, who, when he was 16 years old, made a name for himself by launching this movement because there was an attempt to rewrite the Hong Kong school curriculum to really whitewash a lot of a lot of the Communist Party's crimes over the years. And I don't know if you know this, but people in mainland China don't even know that Tiananmen Square is like a thing that happened.
Right. Yep.
So he took a stand there and now has become one of these youth activists. And there was another controversy about a high-speed rail connecting directly from the mainland to Hong Kong. So, again, these are like, that's something where it seems like, okay, they're just building infrastructure, but for them, getting that physical link there, they just see that as an encroachment on their autonomy, which we also have to distinguish that from independence. They're not a fully independent nation, but they're kind of just trying to hold on to whatever they can at this moment.
So you mentioned earlier they have a arrangement similar to our Constitution. Do you think Hong Kong's culture, how would you describe it? Is it similar to the United States? Do they have? I'm sure they all know about Tiananmen Square and the communist history, and that's why the Chinese wanted to whitewash it. But how would you describe their culture? Is it pretty open, pretty free? Is it similar to the United States? Is it, obviously it's going to be different. They're on the other side of the world, but I think maybe you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, their culture is quite different from the U.S. It's a very international, cosmopolitan city because it's just this like international finance hub. So that's a mixing of a lot of different cultures there. But in terms of their kind of cultural values, there's definitely a similarity there because they have that basic law, which is kind of based on British common law. And obviously our Constitution is also based on British common law. And so we have that commonality. And that's one reason why you sometimes see this imagery of the Hong Kong protesters waving American flags or even singing the national anthem. Part of that is like a cultural association, and part of it is they're trying to communicate to a U.S. audience, we'd love your support.
Now, I a lot of the pictures I see, and generally when you see protests for anything, it's usually younger people. Do you think this movement is pretty wide in Hong Kong, or is this a vocal minority of people? Is this a bunch of teenagers and early 20-year-olds, really pushing it far? What can you tell me about these protesters and kind of the feeling in Hong Kong for the protesters?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the people that are out on the streets are overwhelmingly on the younger side, and this is definitely a youth-driven movement. The question of how much support they have in the wider population. I mean, one thing to note is some of these protests have been huge, thousands, and in one case, I think even approaching 1 million people out on the streets. And this is,
wow.
This is a city of 7 million, so that's a sizable amount of population.
That's
okay.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah. But then the other thing that really answered that question there were in a week or two ago, there were elections, and the pro-democracy faction swept in. Won a huge number of seats, and this was even in kind of rural regions. They were taking seats that were never even thought, I think, in contention. So that's a signal that this does have widespread support. And there's been attempts to say that, this is some sort of operation or like an intelligence operation or something. And that is clearly been undermined as mostly Beijing's propaganda at this point.
Oh, so that's, yeah, because I have been hearing people kind of saying that, like, suggesting that the CIA is involved. So that would be more like Chinese propaganda coming through.
There's a lot of Chinese propaganda. So obviously there are CIA assets all around the world, including in Hong Kong. But to attribute a movement of this size and endurance and breadth, as we've just seen with the recent election, I think does strain credulity.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I've not seen any direct evidence presented that there's really, much to it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think we got a little trigger happy with pointing at certain things where it could be plausible, but
Yeah.
Sometimes the information that's in front of us points to other things.
Yeah,
It's
always good to ask these questions, I think, in foreign policy, and try to look at every angle. But at some point, you have to accept that people who grew up in a certain system, enjoying certain freedoms, and kind of staring down the barrel of a gun, it's pretty plausible that they would be willing to take to the streets and kind of fight for their freedoms.
Yeah, certainly. It would be like a lot of if there was some sort of protest movement happening in the U.S. that was organic and people were just like, oh, it's just Russia meddling.
Yeah.
Like, oh, come on, give us some credit.
That's a good analogy, because to the extent that there's any U.S. influence, I would put it on that level. Like, I'm sure that people in various intelligence agencies are supportive of this movement. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the movement's gotten the support of the U.S. Congress and even the president at this point, for complicated reasons in the case of the president. But that doesn't detract from kind of the underlying ethos and power of the movement.
Right. So you attended some of these protests, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what that was like? Because I mean, I see it on TV and pictures, and you see these just like throngs and throngs of people. Are they all like that? You kind of mentioned that there's some in the thousands, maybe a million, but like, what's like an average, if one exists, an average protest kind of look like?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the interesting things about it, is because of the decentralized nature, there's not exactly an average. A lot of these things are just like impromptu pop-up things where they'll just like be like, we're all showing up at this mall and chanting our slogans for like an hour. Or they'll snake through a certain promenade or something, and it's like a flash mob type mentality, and that's very intentional. One of their mottos is "Be like water," which they adopted from Bruce Lee, which just means like maintain that fluidity. Their earlier protests in 2014 were more modeled on like the Occupy movement, where they would take up spaces, but the problem with that is it's easily cleared, and they're now a more nimble adversary against the police. They're communicating via encrypted channels, anonymous accounts, and that is a lot harder to stop. And I think that again explains the endurance of the movement. Now, one that I attended was a march from this kind of shopping center down to a soccer match. It was a World Cup qualifier between Hong Kong and Iran, and their plan, which they executed, was to boo the Chinese national anthem, which was pretty remarkable to see. Like, it was a really cool experience to like be at this soccer match where everyone's like cheering for their team, which lost, unfortunately for them, but at the same time, chanting political slogans. Just a really interesting and memorable experience that I'll keep with me forever, for sure.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, because you think that we have all sorts of sporting events in the U.S. and most, even the hardcore libertarian, I don't think would go there and start trying to boo the national anthem.
Yeah, and actually, there's been talk about banning that. It's banned, in mainland China, obviously, but they're trying. They, at least at the time I was there, I'm not exactly sure what the status of it is now, to be honest, but they were trying to, enact a ban on booing it. But that was kind of like in the background, and they're just like, yeah, we're gonna go ahead and boo this tonight.
So I can't imagine that would go over well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are these protests pretty peaceful as far as what the protesters set out to do? Because we've seen plenty of protests even in this country and around the world, where there's a lot of property damage, and they're just kind of going out and making a ruckus. Are they pretty under control when they go out, or does it vary?
Yeah, it varies greatly, and I'm sure you've seen the videos that have been coming out of there. Like, there's certainly been violence and property damage, and I mean, there was one really horrific video a couple weeks ago where it appeared that some demonstrators actually set a counter demonstrator on fire, and it was horrifying.
Oh, that's what that was?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
So
that was crazy.
Things, spiral out of control sometimes. And there's a real antagonism with the police where they're shooting rubber bullets and tear gas at them, and they're throwing stuff at the police. So yeah, these are not exactly the most peaceful protests at this point. I think they started with that ambition, but hasn't exactly worked out that way.
Sure. So speaking of the police, like, who are the police? Are they Hong Kongers? Are they Chinese? Like, how does the police force in Hong Kong work?
Yeah, the police are Hong Kong police. And this is what you have to understand about the government in Hong Kong, is that they have their own government, but it's perceived, and I think rightly so, as many of them being puppets of Beijing. Carrie Lam in particular, because she's not elected. She is selected via a sort of arcane, like, electoral college process that is not like our electoral college, even where, like, it more or less mirrors the popular vote. It's their whole system is set up with these stakeholders. So, like, you have people from the business community, people from, like, the education sector, who all have differently weighted votes. And because the system is so, I don't know, arcane in that way, it can kind of be rigged in a way that it always comes out in favor of the Chinese government to get their people stacked both in the executive, and also about half the legislature is not directly elected. And that's another thing they're trying to change. They want direct elections of the entire legislature and the executive, just so that all this kind of monkey business with getting Beijing being able to get their people in there is obviated. And at one point it seemed to work and make sense, because it was, like, made sense for the business community to have a stakeholder. But the Chinese government has infiltrated certain sectors of the economy. As you may know, in China, most of the major businesses have the government has a major stake in them, people on their boards, and this has also happened in Hong Kong. And so that's how they exert influence, and that explains the disconnect between what the people of Hong Kong want, which is being expressed to the degree that they can vote in the elections, and what they are getting in their government.
Yeah, it's so funny trying to we know our own world, and so you look at this, or at least I look at this from kind of the lens of where I am in the United States, and this situation where you're like you're kind of your own country, but you're not. Well, you're not your own country, but you have, I guess, the one country, two system kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's so weird, but it makes sense that, it's just this kind of slow erosion.
Yeah. And it's also something, I know you're anarcho-capitalist and not into the idea of democracy necessarily, but something that all libertarians and I think even anarcho-capitalists have to kind of grapple with here is in this case, they are trying to use democracy to secure their liberty. Like, there's a pretty clear connection there, just because their basic law is kind of like rooted in those liberal values. Like, you can see that, democracy doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes it really is just like a giveaway to the mob. But in this case, a lot of and we can talk a little bit about the politics, the internal politics of the movement if you want, but they are all kind of united on this meta question of like, we all want democracy so that we can like secure these basic rights of going out on the streets without being arrested and harassed and having free speech rights and all these things that we all value as libertarians and classical liberals and anarcho-capitalists.
Yeah, I think that'd be interesting to get into. And I don't hold it against them for trying to
everyone wants
use
self-rule for sure.
Yeah,
no one wants to be ruled by Beijing when you're not in Beijing,
Right.
So no, I totally get that.
Yeah, I think they certainly have a better shot at getting what they want, or at least having it for longer by using some sort of self-determination, even if they're doing that through democracy.
Yes.
I'm sure they don't have Rothbard and all the people we're reading on their shelves to be able to have this.
Self-determination is the phrase that they really use a lot. That's kind of and it's also become a very controversial phrase. There's been attempts, some of them successful, to ban some of these younger activists who've won elections from serving because they promote the principle of self-determination.
And so that's coming from the I guess the puppet Hong Kong. So
yeah,
wait, they elected people and then they just said nope.
Yeah, and that was, this was after the 2014 protests. Okay, so then after that, a bunch of these youth leaders ran for office, won, and then a couple of them were disqualified because they gave very incendiary speeches during their inauguration or their swearing in. And I interviewed one of these people, and he actually is more of a separatist or wants Hong Kong independence. That's another big controversy, is the Chinese government wants to portray them all as what they call separatists, because it's the scary word that gets all the locals, to all the people on the mainland to turn against them and see them as like these evil or like subversive people. But there are people who there is a contingent in there who actually is for total independence, but it's kind of a more radical fringe. But then recently there have been Joshua Wong was disqualified from even running because he had made a statement kind of vaguely saying one day he supports a vote on whether or not Hong Kong should be independent once they get to that point in 2047 where they have to be folded back. Like, that's the level of like digging they're doing to disqualify certain people from serving, even though they would have, in some cases have been elected or would have a really good shot.
Now, do you think that using quotes separatist movement is fairly popular there? I mean, I think of the United States, and if I don't know, Texas wanted to secede, a lot of people will be like, they're crazy. We've been a country here for 200 whatever years. You can't secede. With fought the Civil War. We decided whatever their rationale is. But in Hong Kong, they were part of Britain, or at least British colony, for a long time. And that wasn't that long ago. There's a lot of people alive in 1997 who are still alive today who remember that. So they don't, I mean, as far as I know, unless I'm off here, they don't have a long history of being part of China. When that transition happened, I would imagine, I mean, if that happened here, where I went from under British rule, and as ANCAPs, we all, whatever, don't like any rule, I get that. But if I knew China was coming in, I'd be pretty pissed, and I wouldn't want to be part of China or part of that communist government at all. So is that a more kind of, I guess, popular thought to secede or to be a separatist? Or, and that's interesting at the end of 2047, if China just knows they have to run out the clock and then you're part of China, it's not that far away, really, 27, 28 years, whatever, 27, whenever the date is. So I guess my question is are there a lot of separatists, and would you define or would Joshua Wong say that he is a separatist?
No, Joshua Wong would not say that he's a separatist. He would say that he is for maintaining Hong Kong's autonomy, one country, two systems. And that is the line that pretty much all of the mainstream of the movement takes, is they want to keep, that's like the centrist position. And even though Joshua Wong is not exactly a centrist, he's more of like, he's a little bit of a lefty, actually. But he also, is one of the public facing figures here, and none of them, they just know, I can't say what they know in their hearts, but they know that this is a line that is used against them. And I suspect that's because maybe not a lot of people, they don't want to alienate. I haven't seen the polling on, or know if there is polling on, how many people want to be completely independent from Hong Kong. But I think it's like they can't risk alienating the people who don't want to go that far.
Sure.
And I think maybe some of them just also genuinely, and it's a real open question, like, how would that work? How would they be an independent nation? How would they be able to defend themselves? I don't know. Maybe it would. But it's really, when you hear any of the people, most of the people I talk to for this, who you will see in my videos, if you watch them, do not advocate for full independence. There was one person I spoke to who I mentioned earlier, Baggio Sixtus Lung, who is for independence, and it's he's almost like a right-leaning populist type. Like it's very like cultural for him. And so there is that contingent who, he's like gone out and protested against, immigrants or even like tourists coming from the mainland. Like he wants to keep Hong Kong, and against, globalism and all that stuff. So that's why I was saying, like, the actual ideological makeup of the movement is quite diverse, and there's like some fringes on the right and the left. There's like an Antifa type contingent, and then I would call like the Joshua Wong's Democistos like a sort of like center left type party, and then there's even just like straight up centrist Democrats, who are just, they also believe in the right for the people to vote and elect their representatives, but don't necessarily want to, shake up the system or anything. So the important thing for all of them is that they agree on this larger question of, they don't want Beijing calling the shots for them, and they don't want, the kind of total surveillance mentality that Xi Jinping has in China, and they want to maintain freedom of speech.
So I know Hong Kong has historically been pretty laissez-faire as far as the economy goes. And
Yeah.
what is their free speech like, though? Because you just said that they want to maintain their free speech, but there are also people getting not allowed to hold office because they said something a little bit wrong, or they conveniently interpreted it as being being separatist. So is like free speech over there different from what Americans might consider free speech? Or how does that kind of work over in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I mean, you can see that there are some differences there. Like, I don't think that there's much that you could say that would disqualify you from running for office in the U.S. at this point.
Certainly not legally.
At this point. Yeah. But so the controversy with the self-determination is that they claim that there is basically, under the basic law, that they need to acknowledge that Hong Kong is part of China, and anyone who does not acknowledge that can not faithfully, complete the swearing in ceremony. It's something like that. In terms of free speech, they have a free press, but how free is and also they have freedom of assembly, which is why, one of the former governors described the situation in Hong Kong as this peculiar place where there's liberty without democracy. And that's why, protest has really been their only recourse at times, because if they're voting in all the people they can and they still can't kind of take control of the legislature, and the legislature can't even really do anything without the executive, who they also can't vote on, like, that's not really a useful avenue for affecting political change. But occupying spaces, or just making life really inconvenient, or hurting the economy until the government gives in. It's actually worked in the past, and they've gotten concessions. In this case, they actually got the extradition bill completely withdrawn, but they still want more. I don't know if they're going to get it, but a lot of them told me that they're viewing this as like, this is their last stand. It's now or never. If they give in now and they don't get the opportunity to, put up some more bulwarks against that, encroachment from the mainland, then it's pretty much game over. So that's how a lot of them are thinking about it. And that's why you're seeing the persistence and the willingness to, engage in real, like, street battles at this point, because they just see their entire future at stake. But I think I forgot exactly what your original question there was.
Just about what the free speech was like over there. I think you answered it.
Okay,
pretty well.
Right.
Yeah.
But one other thing I was going to say about free speech was, like, how free is your speech when you're a bookseller selling books that are critical of the Chinese president, and then you get kidnapped and then kind of forced to record this hostage-like apology, and then now are living in exile in Taiwan. Like, that's what happened. That's the context. And so, like, if it's in the law, but that's what happens when you're too critical, or, you're an activist in one of these movements, and you get kind of stalked by the police and have your emails messed with, and all this harassment, and even, like, they have the triad gangs there, which the police have been known to kind of enlist to do their dirty work for them. Like when all that's going on, like even though you have free speech under the law, in practice, what do you really have?
Yeah, and I just saw a video this evening, and I don't know how to verify it, but I'll assume it's true, of a Chinese guy being like interrogated by the police, or like forced to apologize. He apparently made some joke or comment that was negative about the police on WeChat, and so they went and arrested him, and they had him strapped down in this like big metal chair. It reminded me of the end of 1984 when they were re-educating Winston, and they're like, "What did you do?" And he's like, "Oh, I made a joke. Sorry, I had a little too much to drink, and I made a comment about the police. I'm very sorry that I did that." And they're, just kind of sitting there, "Why'd you do that?" And just this incredible intimidation, and just look at this guy just with metal bars strapped to his wrists and his arms and his legs.
Yeah. So I mean,
just like awful.
Yeah,
That's just unbelievable.
Imagine that you're, a 20 something living in Hong Kong that grew up with, the internet and kind of enjoying a relatively free existence. And then you see videos like that, or you read about an entire population of, Uyghur Muslims being re-educated in these camps that we don't even know exactly what's going on inside of. Probably going to put up a little bit of a fight if you think that that's coming soon to a neighborhood near you.
Yeah, we I mean, we as Americans, especially libertarians, there's plenty to complain about what our government does, what it does to us, but at the same time, I mean, you look at videos of that and you realize how lucky we are to not live under that, because that's just absolutely brutal.
And I think there's a lot that you can learn from what they're doing. They're both appreciating that, as you said, and also just the tactics that they are using to resist tyranny and surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
We're not there yet, but you never know, and it's good to observe. You mentioned WeChat earlier. None of them in a second would use WeChat because that's a Chinese social media app that is heavily surveilled. They're extremely skeptical of any, technology that was made on the mainland. They tend to use Telegram for messaging, Signal. Telegram is a really popular one because they can build these huge channels and like people can join without giving up their phone number, and that's what they use for a lot of organization tactics or organizational communications. They even make these de facto or like ad hoc decentralized networks where they use AirDrop, the Bluetooth technology on iPhones to send messages and memes in these like local networks to tell people, we're going to be moving up this way. Here's the map of our route, or the route has changed now, so we're all going to be going this way, or like we're handing this thing back, so keep handing it back. So they're very clever, and they wear face masks everywhere so that they don't get caught on a camera or get sanctioned at work or whatever. They've learned how to diffuse the tear gas, and
I've seen videos of that. They have like a leaf blower and someone runs and pours water on it. It's pretty amazing what they're figuring out.
Yeah, so there's a lot to learn and just kind of absorb just in case anyone is ever facing a similar situation anywhere else in the world.
Yeah. So I know you kind of said in the beginning you don't know, no one really knows what's going to happen, but do you have any feel for how far the Chinese government would kind of go before one side or the other backs down? Because I just talking to people, I hear some people say, oh, they kind of just maybe have to give in. They don't want to. The protesters are pushing this hard. how far do they want the black eye of doing something kind of nasty, and then other people kind of say no, they'll just go in and just mow everybody down if they have to. Do you have a feel for kind of what the temperament of the Chinese government is with that?
It's so one of the things is that, I mean, what they're really worried about is destroying their economy. That's one major concern. And there's this ongoing trade deal with Trump. And unfortunately, Hong Kong is kind of being used as a pawn in that somewhat. I wasn't sure if Trump was going to sign that the Human Rights and Democracy Act into law or not. And I think that it was entirely, instrumental on his part. He just, I guess, figured that it helped him in the trade deal. And that's the kind of interesting thing too. The kind of views of Trump there, they vary as well, because like I said, it's a diverse ideological group. So depending on where they're coming from, they're going to view him differently. But some of them view Trump favorably just because it's a kind of like the enemy of my enemy type situation. Like
right.
If he's like tightening the screws on them and making life a little more difficult, then great. But we all also understand that Trump, has no principles, and he, if anything, I'm sure he seems to view these strong leaders like Xi Jinping as admirable on one level. So he's not their friend in any like grander scheme, but perhaps in some like smaller strategic ways. And as for what China is willing to do, that's what China has really been pushing into new and exciting domains now is soft power. And so what we saw happen with the NBA and that entire controversy, that is China projecting its soft power. And that's that seems to be how they prefer to do things, kind of using the economic influence to get its way. And I guess, that is preferable to the alternative. I do think that if they see this, if it becomes a choice for them between, like, I'm trying to think what it would take for them to act. I think it would have to be, some sort of escalation coming from the demonstrators, some sort of violent act that was perceived as, a challenge to their power.
Right.
I don't know exactly what that would be, but if they get that pretext, I think that is really all they would need to go in and do something really terrible that we don't want to see. But I try to hold out some hope that there's an alternative path there. And I think that from my view of the situation, they need to give the major concession, which is the ability to elect their own people. Like at this point, I don't see this dying down unless that happens, for all the reasons that we've discussed in this conversation. So unless and until that happens, I think there's going to be a major impasse, and like, I don't know, maybe it can die down, especially with the recent elections. Maybe if the people that they just elected actually are able to advance some of their agenda, maybe that will help calm things down. But it's like the ticking time bomb situation. Like if they don't, or if they continue, if they obstruct
the newly elected members of the legislature, then this is only going to drag on and probably escalate.
Yeah, that makes sense. Slappy, do you have anything else? I had one kind of final thing to kind of wrap this up.
Yeah, no, I know we want to be respectful of Zach's time. So, yeah, what do you got, Rallo?
So, Zach, for people that are kind of looking at this, whether they're Americans or really anyone out there, kind of observing what's going on in Hong Kong, what do you think is the most important takeaway that we can see from what's going on there? Like, how should we observe this? What's kind of the right lens to be looking at this with?
I think the right lens to look at it with is just to listen to what the figures in this movement are saying and the language that they're speaking. You know, they're really not asking for anything that sounds terribly unreasonable to me. They're asking for the promise that was made to them, which is that they would have an autonomous political system till at least 2047 to be respected. And they're asking for the right of to, elect the people who they believe will safeguard that promise in that system. So that's one lens to look through, I think, that is important. And then the other lens is just to learn from what they're facing and notice, the patterns of authoritarianism, the ways that surveillance, which might seem subtle at first, can be slowly amped up, and then before you even know it, used in ways you never would have imagined. And to just kind of constantly be vigilant of that and take countermeasures. You don't have to be like a paranoid prepper about it or anything, but just realize that, things can turn fairly quickly sometimes in a dark direction, and it's good to have safeguards. And I think embracing principles like decentralization and embracing anti-surveillance technology like encryption, doing everything you can to push the popularization of these kind of things, and just staying on top of what's going on, who's trying to surveil, who's trying to push authoritarianism, and doing all we can to check that in little ways as we proceed, so that it's not too late if something takes a turn.
Sure. No, I think that's great. Thanks so much for coming on. You want to tell everyone where they can find you?
Sure. You can find me at reason.com. I'm on Twitter as well. My handle is @theabridgedZach. And my videos go on Reason's YouTube channel, which is just YouTube/Reason TV. And I have one coming out this week on homelessness, which I think it's a pretty in-depth look at that ever worsening crisis. And I hope everyone has a chance to check that out. And all the Hong Kong videos are up there on that channel. There's 3 of them. And if this was interesting to you, definitely watch those, because they'll go a bit deeper into all this.
Yeah. Awesome. We'll link to all that on the show notes page. We'll also link to your interview with Nick Gillespie on the Reason podcast.
Great. Thanks.
That's a good one to listen to too.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. No, thank you, Zach. This I learned a ton, and
Same.
I think this is really great information to we see this happening, and it's kind of easy to just assume we know what's going on, but it's nice to have someone actually went over there to explain a little bit on it. So
yeah. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Zach. Have a good one.
All right. Bye.
And we're back. We want to thank Zach Weissmueller again for coming on. It was a lot of great information, and we thank him for sharing it. So let's talk about a free market success story, Slappy.
What you got?
So I don't think I brought this up, but I brought a couple weeks ago. I brought up the orthokeratology at the eye doctor, the contact lens that kind of reshapes your eye. So when I did end up going to the eye doctors to get new contacts and everything, and I did ask him about it, and I said, yeah, I checked with my insurance and they don't cover it, and I know insurance doesn't typically cover it. So what's the deal with that? And he pulled out a sheet and started to explain the whole process with me, and then said, this is what the price is. It was kind of an upfront cost, and it wasn't cheap. And then he said after that, it takes a little bit more maintenance than you normally would get from an eye doctor to make sure everything's going well. So there's like an annual fee associated with it going moving forward after you get the initial lenses. And they have it, there's a slight chance that it doesn't work for you, so it's kind of built into the price. They say, hey, that's kind of on us, but other issues, like if you lose it or you break it, then it's on you to have to buy a new one. So it was funny, normally you go to any doctor, and when things are covered by insurance, if you ask, well, how much is this going to cost, and it's like no one knows. It's
that is true. I do that at the doctor. I do that. Well, like when we take the kids to the doctor just for fun, just to see what their answer is, and it's always, I don't know.
But this one wasn't covered by insurance. It had to be, through out of pocket, and they had it all there. And so I was able to say, you know what, this seems interesting, maybe one day, but not right now. So it was nice. I got my question answered. I want to know how much it costs, and it wasn't like, oh, you got to talk to 8,000 people from different insurance things. So that was nice. That was very nice. So to wrap up again, we'll have all of the places to find Zach on Reason, on YouTube and Twitter over at the show notes page, mcflula.com/173. So this is an interesting, the Hong Kong protests is a pretty interesting thing to cover. It's not the only protests going on in the world. There's a couple other things going on, including in the Netherlands, where they're doing it with tractors. So, everyone thought it was just kind of a stupid shtick. A stupid shtick that I was, mentioning tractors every episode. But, look at this. Tractors are being used to take down governments. So,
and no doubt they're influenced by our show.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
I don't even think that's in question.
Right. So anything positive that happens in the world with protests,
directly we're responsible for. Any negative things was not us.
Yeah, it was Friends Against Government's fault.
Correct.
So, so I think that's a wrap. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you next week.
Peace.